At 07:42 on the morning of 22nd January 1944, over the barren hills south of Monte Cassino, a cold wind cut through dense fog that blanketed the Italian countryside. The sky hung steel grey as Sergeant Bill Hoss Carr of Company E, 2nd Battalion, 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, adjusted his position behind a limestone ridge. His M1 Carbine felt heavier than usual in his hands. His unit had been advancing since 04-3, moving toward German positions entrenched along Highway 6. Then the sound came, low, guttural, unmistakable. A Panzer Maybach engine cutting through the mist somewhere below. Hoss had worked quickly the night before, rigging a 2.5x telescopic sight salvaged from broken binoculars onto his carbine's barrel. The men had mocked it. They didn't understand, but he knew it was his only advantage. As the Panzer began its ascent toward the American position, turret rotating, he brought the rifle to his shoulder. The world held its breath. The morning of 22nd January had begun in darkness, 2 hours before dawn. Company E occupied a series of forward positions along the western approach to Monte Cassino, part of the larger 5th Army offensive against the Winter Line. The ground was frozen, the air sharp with the smell of damp earth and diesel fuel. Sergeant Bill Carr, 32 years old, a machinist from Ohio before the war, had been in Italy since the Salerno landings 4 months earlier. This was different terrain, steeper, less forgiving. As the battalion prepared for the day's advance, Hoss examined his modified carbine in the pre-dawn light. The scope was crude, a lens from a pair of German binoculars found near Altavilla, mounted with wire and electrical tape to a section of pipe that fit over the barrel. When he'd first shown it to the other men 3 days earlier, Corporal Danny Ross had laughed outright. "That thing'll fall apart first shot you take," Ross had said. But Hoss wasn't deterred. The Panzer threat had been growing daily. Intelligence reports indicated at least 2 companies of armour positioned in the hills. The landscape stretched before them, rocky outcrops, scrub vegetation, limited cover. Highway 6 snaked through the valley below, the main supply route to the Abbey. Lieutenant Morrison moved among the positions, checking ammunition counts and radio connections. "Stay sharp," Hoss told the men in his squad, his voice carrying the flat certainty of experience. The battalion radio crackled at 06:15 with the morning's orders. "Expect heavy resistance around objective rally point 7, the operations officer's voice announced. German armour reported in sector. The plan called for Company E to advance along the ridgeline while Company F moved through the valley. It was a coordinated assault, timed to coincide with artillery preparation beginning at 07:30. Hoss checked his watch. 43 minutes. He could see his breath in the cold air. Somewhere to the south, the first guns opened fire. At the battalion aid station, established in a stone farmhouse 2 kilometers behind the line, Captain James Hartley was dealing with equipment failures that had plagued the advance since Venafro. The SCR 300 radios, essential for coordinating armour and infantry, were proving unreliable in the cold. 2 of the 5 sets assigned to the battalion had stopped functioning entirely. The maintenance log for 20th January recorded moisture infiltration, crystal oscillator failure, unable to transmit beyond 800 yards. Hoss knew about technical problems. His carbine had been issued at Salerno, serial number 4738-629, manufactured by Winchester in early 1943. By January it had fired approximately 2,400 rounds. The gas piston showed wear, and the recoil spring had been replaced twice. But his concern wasn't the carbine's basic function, it was the scope. The mounting system was improvised, unstable. Any significant shock could knock it out of alignment. Over lukewarm coffee at 06:45, Hoss and Corporal Ross discussed the day's objective. Ross, a former diesel mechanic from Pittsburgh, understood the limits of field modifications. "I don't trust it past 300 yards, Ross said, examining the scope's attachment points. "But if you need it, you need it." There was truth in that. The M1 Carbine was designed for close-range work, effective to 250 yards under ideal conditions. Against armor, it was nearly useless unless you hit something critical. The men of Company E had developed their own routines, small rituals that helped manage the tension. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski carried a rosary. Sergeant Tom Blake always loaded his magazines in the same order. These habits provided structure in an environment where control was largely an illusion. Hoss understood this. He'd seen men who lost their routines fall apart under fire. At 07:15, the distant rumble of German artillery responded to the American barrage. The sound rolled across the hills, a reminder that the Germans were prepared, entrenched, and equipped with weapons that outmatched much of what the Fifth Army had brought to this sector. The 36th Division's after-action reports from December had noted a disturbing trend, increasing Panzer activity, decreasing American tank availability. The fog began to thin at 09:30 as Company E moved forward from its assembly area. The advance was measured. 50 yards, pause, assess, advance again. Standard infantry doctrine for broken terrain. Hoss moved with his squad along the right flank, maintaining visual contact with the platoon to their left. The limestone ridge provided cover, but the approach to Rally Point 7 required crossing 200 yards of exposed ground. At 09:47, the first German fire came from a position they hadn't identified during reconnaissance. An MG-42 machine gun, dug in near a destroyed farmhouse, opened fire on the lead elements of Company F in the valley. The distinctive sound, 1-200 rounds per minute, twice the rate of an American .30, caliber, cut through the morning air. Men scattered, seeking whatever cover the terrain offered. The sound of M1 Garands and bars answered, but the German position was well protected. Lieutenant Morrison called for smoke. 2 minutes later, white phosphorus rounds from the battalion's 81mm mortars began impacting around the German position. The order came through at 09:52. All elements advanced to Rally Point 7. Hoss watched as men began moving forward through the smoke, crossing the exposed ground in short rushes. It was textbook infantry assault, but the terrain offered little protection. Then the sound changed. Beneath the crack of small arms fire, a deeper rumble emerged from the fog to the south. Hoss recognized it immediately. The Maybach HL 120 engine of a Panzer IV. The tank was moving toward them, its 70-Pfeil gun capable of engaging targets at 2,000 yards. Against infantry in the open, it would be devastating. "Hoss, we need you up here," Ross shouted from a position 30 yards ahead. The sergeant moved forward, staying low, the carbine held across his chest. He could see the Panzer now, partially obscured by fog, its turret traversing slowly as the commander searched for targets. The tank was approximately 100 yards away, moving at perhaps 8 kilometers per hour up the hillside. At that range, the M1 Carbine was effectively useless. The .30 caliber cartridge lacked the energy to penetrate armor at any distance. But Hoss wasn't thinking about penetration. He was thinking about the vision ports, the optics, the vulnerable points where a lucky shot might achieve something. He brought the rifle up, settling the improvised scope against his eye. Through the scope's lens, the Panzer appeared closer but distorted. The magnification was uneven. The field of view narrow. Hoss estimated the range at 200 yards, perhaps slightly less. His heart rate had increased. He could feel it in his chest, in his temples. The wind was light, coming from the northwest at maybe 5 miles per hour. not enough to significantly deflect the round, but enough to matter at this distance. "Hoss, what the hell are you doing?" Ross was beside him now, voice tight with urgency. The question was reasonable. The idea of engaging a tank with a carbine, even with a scope, was absurd by any tactical standard. But the Panzer was closing on their position, and Company F was exposed in the valley below. The battalion's anti-tank assets, two 57mm guns, were positioned a kilometre to the rear, unable to engage at this angle. The radio crackled with Lieutenant Morrison's voice. "Request immediate fire mission. Coordinates 845392. Enemy armour." But artillery response time was measured in minutes, not seconds. The Panzer would be in effective range of the American positions within 90 seconds. Hoss steadied his breathing, a technique he'd learned hunting deer in Ohio before the war. Inhale slowly, exhale halfway. Hold, squeeze. The scope's crosshairs wavered as he tried to find a stable position. The limestone rock beneath him was irregular, offering no solid rest. He adjusted, wedging his left elbow into a crack in the stone. Better. The scope settled. At 09:58, the Panzer fired its main gun at a target in the valley. The 75mm round impacted near Company F's command post, throwing dirt and debris 40 feet into the air. Through the scope, Hoss could see the muzzle blast, the slight recoil of the turret. The tank's commander was visible in the cupola hatch, scanning through binoculars. Hoss centered the crosshairs on the turret's front glacis, then adjusted slightly higher, toward the gun mantlet where the main gun protruded through the armor. Near that point, he knew, were the gunner's primary optics, the TZF-5F telescopic sight used to aim the main gun. It was a small target, protected but not invulnerable. A round striking near the optics might damage the sight, blind the gunner, force the crew to button up and rely on limited vision ports. It was a long shot, probably impossible, but the mathematics of desperation didn't care about probability. The Panzer continued its advance, tracks churning the soft earth, engine noise growing louder. At 300 yards per minute, it would reach an effective firing position overlooking the American lines in less than 4 minutes. Hoss could see men from Company F attempting to withdraw to better cover, but the machine gun position was still active, limiting their movement. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Through the scope, Hoss studied the tank's movement pattern. The Panzer was following the terrain, staying to the harder ground where the tracks had better purchase. The commander was cautious, aware that the Americans might have anti-tank weapons positioned along the ridge. Every 30 seconds, the turret would traverse slightly, the gunner scanning for threats. It was professional work, disciplined. At 10:01, Lieutenant Morrison's voice came through on the radio again. "Fire mission delayed. Gun position repositioning. Translation: no artillery support for at least 5 minutes. Hoss made his decision. He adjusted his position slightly, getting the best possible angle. The carbine's sling was wrapped around his left forearm for additional stability. The scope's reticle steadied on the gun mantlet area. The wind had shifted, now coming more directly from the west. Hoss adjusted his aim point slightly right, compensating. At 200 yards, the 30 caliber round would drop approximately 18 feet, losing most of its energy, but it only needed to hit something critical. He focused on his breathing again, slow, controlled. The world narrowed to the small circle of the scope's view. Ross had stopped talking. The other men in the squad had seen what Hoss was attempting and were watching in silence. It was the kind of moment that combat sometimes produced, everything moving at normal speed but feeling suspended, as if time itself had become elastic. Hoss's finger found the trigger. He squeezed. The M1 Carbine fired at 10:03:17, according to Lieutenant Morrison's watch. The report was sharp, but not especially loud. The carbine produced less noise than the Garand rifles the other men carried. Recoil was minimal, maybe 4 foot-pounds, easily managed. The scope jolted slightly but held its position. Through the lens, Hoss tracked the Panzer for the 2 seconds it took the round to travel 100-200 yards. The bullet struck the turret mantle at approximately 6 inches right of center, near the gunner's telescopic sight housing. The impact was visible, a small flash of metal-on-metal contact, then a spray of fragments as the copper jacket separated from the lead core. The round itself didn't penetrate the armor, it wasn't designed to, but the impact against the gun sight's external housing created a different effect. Inside the Panzer, Obergefreiter Klaus Weber had been peering through the TZF-5F sight, searching for American anti-tank positions. When the impact occurred, the shock transferred through the metal housing directly to the optical tube. The sight's alignment shifted fractionally, enough to make accurate aiming impossible. Simultaneously, a fragment from the round's jacket penetrated the rubber eyepiece seal and struck Weber's right cheekbone. The injury wasn't serious, but the sudden pain and the blood running into his eye caused Weber to jerk back from the sight, striking his head against the turret interior. The tank commander, Feldwebel Ernst Schumann, saw his gunner reeling and immediately ordered the driver to halt. The Panzer shuddered to a stop, turret still pointed toward the American lines, but the main gun no longer tracking. Schumann dropped into the turret to assess the situation. Weber was conscious but disoriented, bleeding from his face. The gun sight was damaged. Schumann could see the misalignment when he looked through it himself. From the ridge, Hoss and the men of Company E watched the Panzer stop. The turret rotated part way, then stopped. Something had changed. "You hit it," Ross said quietly, disbelief evident in his voice. The distance, the improvised scope, the light wind, none of it should have worked. But the tank had stopped. At 10:07, Lieutenant Morrison ordered Company E to advance while the Panzer remained stationary. The men moved quickly, covering the ground to Rally Point 7 in less than 3 minutes. The German machine gun position, seeing the American movement and lacking armor support, ceased fire and began withdrawing. By 10:12, Company E had secured the objective. The Panzer remained in position for another 4 minutes while its crew assessed the damage. Schumann radioed his company commander at 10:14. Gunner injured, main sight inoperative, withdrawing for repairs. The tank reversed course, moving back down the hillside toward the German lines. At 10:23, American artillery, finally in position, began targeting the area, but the Panzer had already withdrawn beyond effective range. Hoss didn't celebrate. He sat behind the limestone ridge, the carbine resting across his knees, and tried to process what had happened. The shot had been necessary, but unlikely. The scope had held together through the recoil. The round had struck within inches of where he'd aimed at 200 yards. Any of a dozen factors could have changed the outcome. A stronger wind, a slightly different angle, the tank moving a second earlier or later. Ross approached, carrying a canteen. "That was the damnedest thing I ever saw," he said, offering water. Hoss drank, nodding acknowledgement, but not speaking. Around them, the men of Company E were consolidating their positions, checking ammunition, treating minor wounds. The morning's objective had been achieved, though not in the way the tactical planners had envisioned. By 10:35, word of the shot had spread through the battalion. Lieutenant Morrison filed his after-action report at 11:00, noting, "Enemy armour withdrew after receiving small arms fire. Exact cause undetermined. No friendly casualties during advance to RP7. The report was factual, understated. It didn't capture the improbability of what had occurred, but military reports rarely did. What the report also didn't capture was the psychological effect on both sides. The American soldiers had seen a Panzer, one of the most feared weapons on the battlefield, disabled by a single rifleman with an improvised scope. The Germans, for their part, had learned that even their armour could be vulnerable in unexpected ways. The implications would ripple through both units in the days ahead. The Panzer IV that Sergeant Carr engaged on 22nd January was destroyed the following day by American artillery during a German counterattack near Sant'Angelo. The tank's destruction was recorded in the 36th Division's G2 intelligence summary for 23rd January. Enemy armour destroyed, 1 PIS KPWI full, coordinates 843-388, artillery fire. The crew had evacuated before the final barrage. Feldwebel Schumann survived the war. Obergefreiter Weber recovered from his facial injury and returned to duty in March 1944. But the immediate consequence of that engagement on the morning of the 22nd was less dramatic. Company E spent the remainder of the day consolidating positions along the ridgeline and preparing for potential counterattack. The men dug fighting positions in the rocky soil, strung communication wire back to battalion headquarters, and established observation posts overlooking the valley. Standard infantry work, repetitive and exhausting. Hoss's rifle scope, examined more carefully in the afternoon light, showed signs of stress. The mounting had shifted slightly from the recoil, requiring readjustment. Ross worked on it for 30 minutes, tightening the wire wrapping and adding additional support from strips of metal cut from a ration can. "It'll probably hold for another few shots," Ross said, "but I wouldn't trust it. Beyond that..." The emotional toll of the morning's battle began to manifest as the adrenaline faded. Private First Class Kowalski, who had been 20 yards from Hoss during the engagement, sat quietly cleaning his rifle, hands shaking slightly. This was his 4th month in combat. Lieutenant Morrison noted in his personal diary that night, "Men showing strain, need rest and rotation, unlikely to receive either." At 16 aid, the battalion received orders for the next day's operations. Company E would continue the advance toward Monte Cassino, this time as part of a larger assault involving 3 battalions. The mission briefing estimated moderate to heavy resistance with likely armour support from German positions dug into the monastery's lower slopes. Expected casualties were projected at 15 to 20%. Hoss cleaned his carbine as the sun set, working methodically through each component. The barrel showed fouling from the day's fire. He cleaned it carefully, paying particular attention to the gas port and piston. The scope remained attached, though he had doubts about its reliability. Still, it had worked once. That counted for something. The night of 22nd January brought cold rain, turning the rocky ground to mud and making the fighting positions miserable. Company E maintained 50% alert, half the men awake and watching while the others attempted rest. Sleep came in brief intervals, interrupted by the sound of artillery exchanges to the south and occasional small arms fire from German patrols probing the American lines. At 03:30 on 23rd January, Hoss was awakened for his watch shift. The rain had stopped, but fog had returned, thicker than the previous morning. Visibility was less than 50 yards. He took his position at the forward observation post, carbine ready, listening more than watching. In these conditions, the first indication of an attack would be sound, boots on stone, equipment rattling, voices in German. The dawn came slowly, grey light filtering through the fog without really illuminating anything. At 06:15, the battalion's scheduled artillery preparation began. 105 mm and 155 mm rounds impacting German positions 2 kilometers to the east. The sound rolled across the hills, a continuous rumble that lasted 40 minutes. When it stopped, the silence that followed felt heavier than the bombardment itself. Company E began its advance at 07 Uhr, moving in 2 columns along the ridge system, toward the day's objective, a hill mass designated Point 593 on the tactical maps, one of the approaches to Monte Cassino itself. The Germans had held this ground for months, fortifying it extensively. Intelligence reports estimated at least one reinforced company in defensive positions, with machine guns, mortars, and likely artillery support. The attack began badly. At 07:23, Company F, advancing through the valley parallel to Company E, encountered a minefield that hadn't appeared on the reconnaissance maps. 2 men were killed. Immediately, 3 others wounded. The advance stalled while engineers worked to clear a path. German observers on the heights called in mortar fire, making the engineers' work even more difficult. By 08:00, Company E had covered less than 400 yards. The terrain grew steeper, the footing more treacherous. Hoss's squad was on point, moving carefully, checking each position before advancing. At 08:17, they encountered the first German position, a machine gun nest constructed from logs and sandbags, positioned to enfilade the approach route. The position was unmanned. The Germans had withdrawn during the night, but the implications were concerning. If they'd withdrawn from forward positions, they were likely concentrating their strength further back, creating a deeper defensive line. The advance continued through the morning, moving from one abandoned position to the next. Each time Hoss expected to find the Germans' main line, but each time the positions were empty. It created a surreal atmosphere. The landscape bore all the signs of preparation for defense, but the defenders had vanished into the fog and broken terrain. At 11:30, Company E reached the base of Point 593's northern slope. Here, finally, the Germans revealed their position. Artillery fire began impacting around the American positions with devastating accuracy. The Germans had pre-registered these coordinates, knowing that any attacking force would have to concentrate in this area. The 36th Division's casualty figures for 23rd of January would later show 47 men killed or wounded in Company E alone during the 4-hour battle for Point 593. Hoss and his squad found cover in a dried streambed, pressed against the rocky walls as German 88mm rounds impacted nearby. The sound was distinctive, a high-velocity shriek followed by a sharp crack as the round detonated. Shrapnel sang through the air above their position. Private Kowalski, huddled next to Hoss, was praying in Polish, words tumbling out in a steady stream. Lieutenant Morrison called for smoke and counter-battery fire, but the battalion's supporting artillery was engaged with other targets. The company was pinned down, unable to advance or withdraw without taking significant casualties. The fog, which had provided concealment earlier, now trapped them, making it impossible to see the German positions on the slope above. At 12:05, the German artillery stopped. In the sudden silence, Hoss heard something worse, the sound of tracked vehicles moving on the road below Point 593. Not one vehicle, but several. Tank engines growing louder. The Germans were committing armor to the counterattack. Ross crawled over to Hoss's position. "You still got that scope?" he asked. The question seemed absurd given the circumstances, but Hoss understood the implication. If they could identify the German armor's positions and strength, Morrison could call in more effective fire support. Hoss checked the carbine. The scope was still attached, though covered in mud. He wiped the lens clean with his shirt sleeve. "Let's see what we can see," he said, moving carefully to a position that offered a better view down into the valley. Through the scope, partially obscured by fog, he could make out the shapes of tanks, at least 3, possibly more. They were Panzer IVs, moving in line toward the American positions. The information that Hoss relayed to Lieutenant Morrison at 12:18, 3 Panzer IVs moving north on the road below Point 593, approximately 1,500 yards distant, was passed up to battalion and then to division fire support coordination. At 12:31, American P-40 Warhawks from the 27th Fighter Bomber Group arrived over the target area. The aircraft made 3 passes, dropping 500-pound bombs and strafing the road with 50 caliber machine guns. Through his scope, Hoss watched as one Panzer took a direct hit, the explosion lifting the turret completely off the hull. The other tanks scattered, seeking cover in the tree line along the road. The German counterattack, which might have overrun the American positions, was broken before it fully developed. By 13:00, Company E was able to resume its advance. The cost, however, had been significant. By the time Company E reached the crest of Point 593 at 15:30, they had suffered 23 casualties, 6 killed, 17 wounded. The German defenders, as predicted, had withdrawn to positions further up the mountain toward the monastery itself. Company E, reduced to less than 60% of its original strength, consolidated on the objective and prepared defensive positions for the night. Hoss's rifle scope, examined after the engagement, had finally failed. The mount had cracked during the morning's artillery barrage, and the lens was no longer properly aligned. The improvised system had survived exactly 2 days of combat use. Ross looked at it and shook his head. "Surprised it lasted this long," he said. There was no point in trying to repair it. The materials for a proper mount didn't exist in the field, and the battalion had no gunsmiths who could fabricate the precision parts needed. But the scope had served its purpose. The shot on 22nd January had disabled one Panzer. The observation on 23rd January had provided targeting information that destroyed another and disrupted the German counterattack. For an improvised piece of equipment constructed from salvaged parts, it had exceeded any reasonable expectation. That evening, as Company E settled into defensive positions on Point 593, Hoss removed the scope from his carbine and set it aside. The rifle returned to its original configuration, a standard M1 Carbine, effective to 250 yards, sufficient for the close-range work that characterized most infantry combat. The brief experiment in extended-range precision fire was over. The 36th Division's advance toward Monte Cassino would continue, but it would be measured in yards and paid for in casualties, one rocky hillside at a time. The battle for Monte Cassino would continue for another 3 months. The 36th of Infantry Division's assault on 22 to 24th of January 1944 was only the opening phase of what became 4 separate offensives involving American, British, Indian, New Zealand, Polish, and French forces. The monastery itself was not captured until 18th of May 1944. The Allied casualty figures for the entire Cassino campaign exceeded 55,000 men. Sergeant Bill Carr remained with Company E through February 1944, participating in the consolidation of positions south of the monastery. On 12th of March, he was wounded by shell fragments during a German artillery barrage and evacuated to a field hospital near Naples. His wounds were not life-threatening. Multiple lacerations to his left arm and shoulder, treated with 16 stitches and a course of sulfur drugs to prevent infection. He returned to duty on 30 April, rejoining the 143rd Infantry Regiment in time for the final offensive that broke the German winter line. The improvised rifle scope was not mentioned in any official after-action reports. Lieutenant Morrison's Daily Journal entry for 22nd January noted only, "Enemy armour engaged and disabled by small arms fire during advance to RP7. The mechanism by which this occurred, an M1 Carbine with a makeshift telescopic sight engaging at 1-200 yards, was documented only in the personal recollections of the men who witnessed it. Corporal Danny Ross mentioned it in a letter to his family dated 28th January. Saw the damnedest thing last week. Hoss knocked out a German tank with his carbine. Don't ask me how. The tactical significance of the engagement was limited. One panzer temporarily disabled, one day's objective secured with minimal casualties. In the context of a campaign that would consume 3 months and cost 55,000 casualties, it barely registered. Yet the men who were there remembered it. The shot demonstrated something beyond tactical success. It proved that adaptation, ingenuity, and individual skill could affect outcomes even in an industrial war dominated by artillery and armour. Company E's casualties for January 1944 totaled 37 men killed or wounded, a 31% loss rate that was slightly below the division average for that month. The company was rebuilt with replacements in February, many of them recent inductees with minimal training. By the time of the final Cassino offensive in May, only 18 of the original soldiers who had landed at Salerno in September 1943 remained with the unit. The final report on the 36th Infantry Division's operations at Monte Cassino was filed on 8 June 1944. The document, 63 pages of typed text with attached maps and casualty tables, made no mention of improvised rifle scopes or individual acts of marksmanship. It focused instead on logistics, fire support coordination, unit rotations, and lessons learned regarding mountain warfare. This was appropriate. After-action reports served strategic purposes, not narrative ones. Yet buried in the appendices, in the equipment loss and malfunction reports, was a single line. M1 Carbine, serial 4738629, action jammed, replaced 15th of March 1944. The rifle that Sergeant Carr had carried since Salerno had finally worn out, its gas system failing after approximately 5,200 rounds fired. It was turned into ordnance, evaluated as beyond field repair, and likely melted down for salvage metal. The scope, having been removed on 23rd of January, was discarded at some point afterward. No record exists of its final disposition. Bill Carr survived the war. He was discharged in November 1945 with the rank of Staff Sergeant, returning to Ohio, where he resumed work as a machinist. In later years, he rarely spoke about his combat experiences. When asked about the incident with the Panzer, he would acknowledge it happened, but would not elaborate. "Got lucky," he would say. "That's all it was." Danny Ross also survived, returning to Pittsburgh and his previous work with diesel engines. He maintained correspondence with several men from Company E through the 1950s. In a letter dated 12th of April 1953, he wrote to another veteran, "Been thinking about Italy lately, don't know why. Remember that day Hoss shot the tank? Still can't believe that actually happened. But I was there, saw it myself." The historical record confirms the basic facts. Company E, 2nd Battalion, 143rd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, engaged German armour on 22nd January 1944 during the advance toward Monte Cassino. One panzer was temporarily disabled by rifle fire at extended range. The engagement contributed to the successful capture of Rally Point 7 with minimal casualties. The unit continued operations in the sector until relieved in March 1944. What the record cannot quantify is the human element, the combination of necessity, ingenuity, skill, and improbable luck that produced an outcome nobody could have predicted. The war was full of such moments. Most were never documented at all.